Philip is our kind of example of what happens. Steve Walton's new commentary talks about Philip being the kind of representative migrant who then goes to Samaria. So it's a forced migration that takes Philip to Samaria. He doesn't really plan to go there, but he has to get out of Jerusalem because it's too dangerous. And then if you move on, I think it's Acts 11:19, we have another summary statement about the scattered ones and how they went about sharing the word.
We almost already covered it, but it's like, why decide to study migration in relation to biblical studies? Maybe another question, why migration in Acts and not an Old Testament text?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was so it's maybe something that Paul's left behind, but he does talk about that experience in quite a positive way, and he uses that experience as being a Pharisee as something that actually gives him credibility. Sometimes in our accurate translation, with some of that kind of negativity kind of slips in, and Paul's actually making a positive case, and that kind of comes through in the Greek. So we have this big cast of kind of scattered migrant characters who are really important to the development of the church. I think one of my favorite ones is...
Welcome back to another episode of Exploring the Language of Scripture, brought to you by Greek Tutoring, the place for personalized Greek studies in your spare time. My name is Daniel Mikkelsen. I'm your host. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh in New Testament and Christian Origins and the founder of Greek Tutoring. And this podcast exists to make gyms from biblical studies accessible to everyday Christians and show you how the biblical languages opens up Scripture so that you will be increased in your love for God and His Word and His mission. And today I'm joined by Paul Wilson. Hi. A fellow PhD candidate in New Testament and Christian Origins here at the University of Edinburgh. Paul is also working on human migration in the book of Acts, which we'll be talking more about later on in this episode. And I'm sure this will be very interesting because I don't know many people who are linking migration with biblical studies. So I'm very interested about what he has to say about that. So stick around for that. Apart from his studies, Paul is also an associate lecturer at the Scottish Baptist College. He has also coordinated the refugees and asylum seekers outreach in Parkhead Nazarene Church in the east end of Glasgow. Before this, Paul studied in Belfast in Northern Ireland. He also worked at a Greek NGO in Athens, and he completed a master's in biblical studies here at the University of Edinburgh as well. And I had the privilege to getting to know Paul while we were studying here. We are recording here today in New College. Yep. That's why we have these interesting chairs. And had a privilege to get to know him, and we have had many interesting conversations and things done together while we study here at university together. So it's a great honor to have you on a podcast here today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, you're welcome. The honor is all mine.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add before we jump into the questions?
I mean, not really. I think that pretty much covered everything. I'm also, sometimes my accent throws a few people off because I'm not actually from Scotland. I grew up in the States. My wife is from Belfast, so I speak English sometimes with a bit of a hybrid accent. So I grew up in the States, but I've now moved out here in 2001, or moved to Belfast in 2001. And so I've now spent more than half my life outside the States. So it's a funny place to be in. So I'm a migrant who studies migration.
Yeah,
that's an interesting perspective, interesting place to be.
Definitely.
I'm also married and I've got 2 kids as well who are, next year I'll have 2 high schoolers. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, interesting.
New stage of life.
Yeah, so let's jump into it.
Yeah.
So how did you get into studying of the biblical languages?
It's a good question, and it's not something I'd really planned. So my undergraduate studies were mostly in kind of theology and missiology and that side of things. And I actually really struggled with the biblical languages. So it's not something that I particularly enjoyed or really got into. And it was definitely my sort of weaker hand in studies. The desire to get back into biblical studies really came after I started working with refugees and asylum seekers. And it tends to be in the context that I've worked in. I've had a lot of people coming who follow other religions, and primarily Muslims mostly, and they have a lot of great theological questions, especially questions about the Bible and text. And I don't think this is a route that everyone needs to take if they're engaging with those questions, but I just felt for myself, I really need to learn more about the biblical languages and have just a greater understanding of the text that I'm talking about. So that led me into doing a top master's here at New College in Biblical Studies, and that had both Greek and Hebrew. And again, it wasn't something that came very naturally or very easily to me, but it was good, and it was a good challenge really to work on the things that I probably found more difficult. So that was really where it started, was just wanting to engage in those questions in a deeper way, and just for my own integrity in dealing with those questions and having a better understanding of my own text.
I think that's great, and I think like emphasizing the fact that you also struggled is that I think sometimes people, they think that people who do PhDs, they always found like the languages easy, or they found the studies easy, or but it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, no, most definitely not. I mean, it's still you're still always learning new things, and you'll sometimes read a text and you'll think, I'm really struggling with this one, or there's some grammar that you don't know. I mean, I've been looking at a lot of inscriptions lately in papyri, and I was looking at one the other day and I was really struggling just to decipher the hand. So there's always something to learn, and it's just the start to a journey. But I don't think I've ever, I mean, maybe my supervisor or Paul Foster or someone like that gets to a stage where they can just pick it up without much effort. But I think you're always learning, you're always finding something new, which is really exciting and keeps it interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think we all always learning. Obviously, things becomes, well, excuse me. Some things might become easier over time.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm definitely, so you might not know, but I mentioned on the podcast before, I'm dyslexic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for me, like, school was not fun at all.
Yeah.
So it's all about like effort, and also looking at it as a skill you're learning, like you're riding your bike, or you're studying, you're doing like skiing or football or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, more think of it, like if you think about languages that way, then I think you're not necessarily as easily thrown off, because it's about the consistency and staying at it. And then if you want to like read like inscriptions, then you can go ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is like obviously at a different level, because it also includes different like handwritings, or if you're reading papyri, so it's it's a completely different thing.
But you start moving into a whole nother discipline.
But so maybe we shouldn't do that.
Yeah, maybe not.
So how have you experienced that the biblical languages had opened up scripture for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think you'd have a really fruitful enjoyment of reading the Bible and engaging with the text, but sometimes you see things and you see it with a certain kind of color or clarity maybe that you don't see before, or even you just see things that are interesting that you didn't notice before. One thing that's always been interesting to me is when you come across, look at all the decisions that need to be made with translation as well, that you have a greater appreciation for what a difficult job translation is. But sometimes you'll see things, you'll think, oh, I have to make a decision about how I translate or how I conceive of this, and that's not always the most straightforward thing to do. So I think that it can give you greater appreciation for what scholars do on a day-to-day basis. So I think that it helps enrich your understanding, because you get really drawn into the text, and why is this word used here? So I work in Luke and Acts, and he loves using unusual words, and you think, why did he pick that specific word for, say, a belt, when another perfectly much more common word for a belt exists? Why is he using this particular word? So that's always an interesting one. It can bring out a lot of color. And I think the other thing that I didn't appreciate before I had taken the biblical languages here at Edinburgh was appreciating the different styles and types of writing that we have in the New Testament canon, which is really exciting, because, Mark, you have a really great fast-paced storyteller, it's all pretty easy to read, and it just rolls across really quickly. And then you get to someone like Luke, and it's a very different way of telling the story. It's much slower. It's got the much more complicated vocabulary. It's just a different way to draw you into the story and brings different things out of the story, which is really exciting. But I think sometimes in our English translations, or any translation really, you're trying to make it readable, you're trying to make it accessible, but it's very hard to replicate what is kind of quite simple language
Mm.
to what is quite complicated language. And so there's
Yeah.
a balance to be found in translation. It's not always easy, but you see
Yeah.
that just the sheer variety that we have in our New Testament text, which is pretty cool.
Quite interesting. Yeah, I think like Luke is much more comparable to like other ancient historians,
Definitely.
like Herodotus, and like not that they're writing using the exact same language, but his style is more like, so to speak, similar to these writings than where Mark is more sort of this. We just want to tell people the story as it is, like efficiently. And clearly as possible. Doesn't have to be like too many difficult words. There might be like some words used like specifically at times, but yeah. So I appreciate that like nuance in it. And you don't necessarily see that Peter is much better Greek, than like 1 Peter is much better Greek than 2 Peter, for example. Because in a translation you're sometimes smoothing things out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we kind of flatten the text a little bit in translation, and of course we want to translate, so you want the stuff to be understandable. But yeah, you just get a greater appreciation for, or just for even the kind of almost the personal flavor of the text that you're reading, how the personalities of the authors come through, which is really exciting.
Yeah, exactly. You might get that in John in comparison to some of the other Gospels.
Yeah,
a little bit of the personality, the style, but that's because he is he's so different to the other ones.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, you might get it in translation, but where it's like, how can we distinguish between Paul and 1 Peter, for example, in terms of like,
true.
When we read in translation, Paul, he uses lots of insight, but the same it's the same in Peter, but like the word use and the way they've structured the sentences are very different.
It's a very different type of rhetoric, and it's you see that when you're doing translation work and you're reading through in the original languages, and that's it keeps it really interesting and makes it really fun. And I think the first thing that I noticed when I started getting into the languages, and this is great. You get more of the flavor of the kind of personality that's behind the text, which is exciting. It makes it seem a bit more real at times.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Do you have any sort of like more specific examples for how you've seen like something in the original that you didn't see in the translation or didn't notice in the translation?
Full disclosure, you sent me some of these questions beforehand, and I really struggled to narrow this one down because there's so many things. But one that I came across relatively recently that I thought was really interesting was the translation of the word akrivos, or akrivis. Sorry, the other thing that is difficult for me with Greek at times is that I lived in Greece, so I spoke modern Greek, and there's a lot of it's a false friend at times because there's a lot of similar vocabulary, but different pronunciations, especially so. But sorry, so I used a modern Greek word there when I said akrios, but akrivis, and the whole kind of word family around that, and when Paul was talking about his credibility when he as a Pharisee, so we're moving Paul's finished the missionary journeys, and he's gone to Jerusalem, and he's going to be sent to Rome, and he's defending himself. So the first thing, he defends himself in front of the temple, in front of a group of Jews, in front of the temple, and then later on in front of Agrippa, and he talks about his training as a Pharisee. So we have akrivia and we have akrivis, and most of our English translations, I looked through maybe about 10 or so, and they all describe when Paul talks about being a Pharisee. He always talks about it being strict. I was from the strictest sect. It was a strict Pharisee. We use this word strict. We rewind a bit, right? We go to Acts 18:2, where we meet Priscilla and Aquila, and we meet Apollos.
Yeah.
And we have the same word family. We have akrivis again, but it says they explain the gospel accurately, right? And when Priscilla and Aquila, they take then, because Apollos is already an accurate teacher of the gospel, and then Priscilla and Aquila take him aside, and then they explain to him the way even more accurately. So you have these words used again, but it's used in quite a positive way. And it's the same word. And it's interesting because I think because we have Pharisee in the language. We think, oh, we must use strict there. But in the context, and that was something that came through in the original language, it's actually the same word. And when I'm thinking about Priscilla, Aquila, Apollos, I think, oh, it's accurate. Accurate clarity around that. But when I apply it to Pharisees, I think, oh, strict. And that kind of has a negative connotation in English. But when you think about Paul giving his own defense, he's saying, I was from, a very a clear and accurate sect. I knew the law really well, because he's defending himself. He's not saying I'm from a group that that I didn't like, or maybe. I mean, when he does describe being with the Pharisees, especially when he's in speaking in front of Agrippa, he uses the aorist and he says "ezisa." So it was a group that he used to live in. And so that you could say if that's a completed action, if you're talking about the aspect of the verb. But so it's maybe something that Paul's left behind, but he does talk about that experience in quite a positive way. And he uses that experience as being a Pharisee as something that actually gives him credibility. So he's using it in quite a positive way. And I think sometimes in our accurate translation, with some of that kind of negativity kind of slips in, and Paul's he's making a positive case, and that kind of comes through in the Greek. And it's a funny translation choice, because why would we not use then, Apollos was a strict teacher of the law, and then Priscilla and Aquila took him aside and explained the way to him more strictly? It wouldn't really make sense. So it's interesting that Luke uses the same word in kind of similar contexts about persuasion, but we look at one as being positive, one as being negative. I think it's, that kind of gets into some of the within Judaism debates as well, which I don't want to get into now really, but I think with that one, I think what's interesting though is it's more about, I'm trying to think about that from the perspective of Paul's rhetoric, and he's really trying to make a positive case. So like, look, I knew this stuff really well.
Yeah.
We knew the law I knew the law very accurately. This is how I was at the feet of Gamaliel. We had this stuff so he's using that to back up his own credibility in front of a Jewish audience. So it's quite, so you kind of get the positive tones to that word, whereas maybe we lead to something a bit more negative.
Yeah. Or at least it's been translated to like the more negative meaning. Yeah. Where the context, because words are flexible today.
Of course, yeah.
But you will make the case that it's actually a bit more positive the way it's used in the context.
Yeah, I think in that case, he's trying to show that he's credible to a Jewish audience. So
and which makes sense.
Which makes sense. If you're making a positive case, you would kind of. So so it's not. I think it's not really a binary of positive or negative. But when we translate in English, we kind of have to pick a gloss that reflects something like that, and that's an interesting one. And there probably is a good case for making it strict, or using strict instead, or making it a more negative one. But you then realize what goes into looking in the context. How do I translate this? Is it a positive case? Is it a negative case? How does that actually change my reading of the context here?
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. And also in the previous episode, we talked about James, where he uses the word for pirazzo, I think it's pirazzo if I pronounce it correctly, which means to tempt, but it can also means to fail test.
Yeah.
Which is, in Greek, there is no difference between the two words, but the context is what makes the difference.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting sort of perspective on the.
Yeah.
James 1, that's what happened, but you can go back and look at that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So.
I could give another example.
Yeah, please,
especially, the other, I think one of my favorite things when I read Greek is actually encountering words that I don't know, because then it brings you into this world of where did this stuff, why is Luke using that word? And I mentioned the belts earlier, because there's a bit where Paul's in Ephesus and the people are touching his clothing to get healing. The healing comes from God, but the people seek out Paul's garments and then they receive healing. It's God who does the healing, but the people are trying to touch Paul's clothes. And you get these two really odd words. You have sudarion and simikinethon.
Probably the only place it occurs in all New Testament.
Yeah, and and I've just pronounced that. It's so rare that I've pronounced it incorrectly. So sudarion, which is a Latin loanword, and then we have simikintheon. Okay, simikintheon, which is another Latin loanword, and it doesn't appear in any literary text. So you have to go to the Latin to figure out what it means. And it comes from semicinctum, which just means narrow belt. But most translators take that word for belt and call it an apron. It's a workman's apron, and it's in, it was in an F.F. Bruce commentary written maybe 40 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And he says it's a workman's apron, and this is repeated in a lot of the dictionaries as well.
Uh-huh.
But when you look at some of the texts, this Latin word is never used in the context of labor. It's just a general belt. It doesn't have a specific labor context. It could be used in labor, but it doesn't necessarily need to.
Yeah.
And so they're really, because we have zoning, we have really common words for belt. So why does Luke use these really unusual words? So I think in some ways you have these words that are so uncommon that you have to kind of look at them and think, why is he using these uncommon Latin loanwords? It maybe shows that he knew Latin as well, and he was, kind of working in both linguistic worlds. But why does he? Because he uses a more typical word for belt elsewhere. So why does Luke use this very specific language? But both the words he used, sudarium and semicinctum, both of these words they're oddly specific words, but also unusually broad in their application, and we can use for all sorts of things in sort of Jewish and Greco-Roman contexts. And I kind of get the idea that Luke is really making the point. It's kind of like a narrative description of Paul as being all things to all people. So it makes you stop, like, you think this is the kind of clothes that Paul is wearing. These are very specific words used, but I can see lots of different contexts that this belt and the handkerchief can be used. It's in both contexts in which Paul is working in Ephesus. So the sudarium is used you can look up in rabbinic texts and see how this kind of handkerchief is used in all different ways. You can use it for your head, you can wrap it around your feet, you can put phylacteries in it, you can do all sorts of things with this handkerchief. Or Greco-Roman orators would use it to, dramatically dab the sweat off their brow, or even use it to cover a mouth, or to do all sorts of things. So they're very specific words, but very broad in application. And that seems like a deliberate choice that Luke has made there. And I think, the workman's apron isn't necessarily a bad translation. It makes sense given Paul's role as a laborer. But if you just read that, if you just think, oh, they were touching Paul's handkerchiefs and belts, we just pass over it and we just move on with the story. Think, wow, there's a healing. That's amazing. But I think even with these kind of this very deliberate vocabulary that Luke chooses, when you read it in the Greek and you have to think, why is he using these unusual words? Then it brings you deeper into this whole world of classics and rabbinics, and it's really exciting to kind of think about where these things come from and why he's using these words.
Yeah, it's very interesting that he's using these Latin loanwords when there are like perfectly applicable,
perfectly good Greek words that are a lot more common.
Which is used so as opposed to when the prophet is binding his feet. Normal word for belt. So
it is. Yeah, that's that. Yeah. So when Agabus takes off Paul's belt, that would be our standard Greek word for belt, but he uses a different word for belt in this case.
Yeah.
So it's curious.
Yeah. So it seems deliberate.
It definitely does seem deliberate. I mean, it's so uncommonly attested that it's got to be deliberate.
But it can be difficult to then. So was there a specific reason?
Yeah, and the specific reason, then we have to look into the context and try to use our own.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good theories for why he used it. I've offered one, but there's lots of other ways to interpret. But then we have to use, we have the rudimental aspects of the language, but then we still have to kind of engage our theological imagination to think about why is Luke communicating to us in this way, which is a great way to get deeper into the text, because you have to ask questions of the text and ask questions of yourself. Why am I using this word? Why am I saying apron rather than belt?
Yeah. Very good. Very good. That's interesting. That's shows why there's interesting nuggets to find.
Yeah, there's always something like that. And I love a hapax legomenon.
Yeah, if you don't know what that means one's used. So within the biblical literature, New Testament usually. So is actually Greek meaning one said, time said.
Time said.
So, but why study migration, and what do you actually mean by that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think migration is very much a constant in human history. So
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps the algorithm and helps the podcast grow. Thank you for your support, and now back to the episode. Why study migration, and what do you actually mean by that?
yeah, it's a good question. And I think migration is very much a constant in human history. So it's just part of human experience. It's part of life. And even this, we kind of approach the text sometimes from a sedentary perspective. I mean, it's interesting because neither of us are from Edinburgh, but we're both sitting here talking about, migration. But it's a very normal part of human experience. People move because of climate changes, or there's a flood, or also people are constantly moving about, and it's kind of intrinsic to human experience. Yeah. And I think now, because the way we conceive of the world with lines on a map, and that we tend to look at nation state as a much more solid thing, but that's very much part of our context in the world in which we live, having these kind of very firm boundaries and kind of lines on the map. And there were boundaries and borders, of course, in the ancient world, but they were organized in slightly different ways. And so I think because human migration is such a big part of human history and such a big part of our experience now, it occurred to me that it's likely to have been part of Luke's context. Luke describes a lot of, I think that's actually where the starting point was for me, was I started reading Acts and sort of thinking about people are moving all the time. And there's a lot of people who, when Luke introduces people, it's always interesting to see, he'll introduce people and say where they're from. And if you look at where the action is happening in the text, more oftentimes than not, these people aren't from the place where they're introduced. And then there's characters like Timothy, because we meet him in Lystra, but then he never goes back there. So you get this kind of very migratory, mobile picture of early Christianity that emerges in Acts. Yeah. And so that was one reason why I wanted to look if migration might be an interesting angle to look at the book of Acts, because there hadn't been a whole lot written on it up to that stage. But it's a big deal in Roman history at the moment. There's been a lot of scholars of Rome who are talking about migration, levels of migration in the Roman Empire. We now have more ways to measure migration movements. So we used to kind of base it all on epigraphy and inscriptions. So on gravestones, people would quite often say, you find a grave in Rome that says I'm trying to think of stereotypical that, this is Gaius and he's from Macedonia, but he's buried in Rome. He must have traveled at some stage because he's from this place, but now he's here. Yeah. But generally, people who are able to afford inscriptions are quite often they have money to afford a funerary inscription, or they have family that could afford that sort of thing. But there's been kind of advances in bioarchaeology where they can look at the strontium isotopes that are left in teeth. They can see lots of patterns of migration and return migration. So I think it's a scholar named Renz Tacoma. I believe he suggests that the probably migrant population of Rome, as in people who were residing in Rome who weren't from Italy, that kind of geographic area, about 30%, maybe 25 to 30% of the population were not from the area or had traveled in. So it's pretty high levels of migration, and it would be on a par with modern day Glasgow or Manchester, something like that. So pretty significant levels of migration.
Even Edinburgh in some way.
Yeah, Edinburgh definitely as well. Yeah, I mean, any major city. And that would probably be, even though the bioarchaeological studies are really expensive, so they can't do this it's very difficult to do in every grave that you might find around, but they think that it was probably, this is at any kind of major port or any major city in the Roman Empire, this probably would have been common, and that people would have moved for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, so we almost already covered it, but it's like, why decide to study migration in relation to biblical studies? And maybe another question in the same, like, you might answer both of them in the same time. There is also, why migration in Acts and not an Old Testament text?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was when I had my 1-year review here at Edinburgh, and we had my supervisor and a secondary supervisor, and then we had another staff member who was from outside the discipline. And when I'd sent the materials through beforehand, it was an Old Testament lecture. It was Susanna Miller, and she looked at it and she said, I was kind of surprised that you were proposing this as something new, because we've been doing this in Old Testament studies for years, and this is, we've been doing this for a long time. But I suppose with Old Testament or Hebrew Bible studies, it's a lot more straightforward in some ways, because you have a defined group of people who a big part of that story is exile and return. So you have a forced migration, you have a return migration, and it's quite clear. And then when you get to the New Testament, the gospel is mostly action. Takes place within one geographic area. It takes place in ancient Palestine, right? There's not a whole lot of travel outside of that. But then once we get into Acts, you have this kind of outward movement that the book ends up kind of covering almost all parts of the known world at the time. So it's a huge, there's so much traveling in the book, and there's a lot of discussion about Paul as a traveler, but that has kind of an intentional aspect to it. But Paul's not just a traveler. He's a prisoner at one stage. He gets driven. He's a forced migrant at times, because he gets driven out of cities. He's not allowed to stay because of the social disruption that he causes. And I think there's sociologically, the field of migration studies is really interesting, because it builds on the experiences of migration, how communities react and respond. And it's a big area of study, and it's not one that has really been applied to New Testament studies. It has been done with Old Testament, but not New Testament studies. So I've looked at a book where there's lots of migration. It's been done quite fruitfully with the Old Testament, but not so much with the New. So that's where hopefully my work, I would like to fill a gap. And it's not so much to say, there's been a lot of things written on what does the New Testament say about how we respond to migration now in terms of policy, ministry, mission, these kind of things. But more what I'm looking at is kind of the other way around. What does migration now? How do the social dynamics of migration now? What does that tell us about migration in the ancient world? How does that help us better understand some of the things that are happening in the book of Acts?
Interesting. Yeah. So where do we actually find migration in Acts?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's once you see it, you'll start finding it everywhere. So one of the kind of key statements in Acts is when Jesus ascends at the beginning of Acts, of course, and he gives instructions to disciples. And one of the major kind of statements that sets the program for the rest of the book is Acts 1:8.
Yeah.
It says, "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So the first thing is this: Jesus gives this prophecy. This is going to happen. And you have this geographic expansion of the Christian movement. And so, and the plot kind of follows that Acts 1:8 pattern for the rest of the book. So the action starts in Jerusalem, and then there's a key moment when Stephen gives his speech. So there's a few migrants who come in. We meet Barnabas, who comes from Cyprus, and so we have the Hellenists in Jerusalem. So we have the presence of migrants, but not a whole lot of migration at that stage. But then when Stephen gives his speech, if you actually go back to the speech, and it starts with Abraham outside the Promised Land, and it talks all about his journey to the Promised Land, and then he has to leave because of famine, and then it talks about Joseph being forced to go to Egypt, but then his brothers joining him because of famine, and then they go, and then there's the Exodus, and it follows this kind of story. It's actually like a migration history of the people of God, and it kind of culminates with this discussion about the temple and its role. And the major charge against Stephen is that he was speaking against this holy place. Stephen, it almost takes the criticism that was about Jesus destroying the temple, and they take it and apply it. It goes to, that kind of falls on Stephen. And Stephen never criticizes the temple per se in that way. He never says this thing is, useless and you shouldn't care about it. That's definitely not what he says. But he seems to suggest that, God is not geographically located. And if you think that God is located in the temple, then you've misunderstood what it's for. And his whole story kind of culminates through, look how active God has been with our people outside of the land. God has always been active with us, even when we haven't been geographically located. And he tells this story of diaspora, he finishes telling the story of diaspora, and then he sees the ascended Jesus, and that's when, of course, everyone gets really angry, and he gets stoned and he dies. Then immediately after Stephen dies, and everyone, it says the whole church was scattered. But we have to go back to Greek. We have this really interesting substantival participle. We have hoi diasporantes, which is really uncommon because you have a great word for diaspora that exists. You
have a prefix now.
Yep, it is. Yep, and so that's one of the first collective words that's used of Christians. They have the hoi diasporantes, and they go out and they. Philip is our kind of example of what happens. Steve Walton's new commentary talks about Philip being the kind of representative migrant who then goes to Samaria. So it's a forced migration that takes Philip to Samaria. He doesn't really plan to go there, but he has to get out of Jerusalem because it's too dangerous. And then if you move on, I think it's Acts 11:19. Also, we have another summary statement about the scattered ones and how they went about sharing the word. And so that's kind of one of the first collective words used for Christians. And then the other one that we probably know a bit better is the way, which of course isn't we say the way with capital T and a capital W in a lot of our translations, but it's just the road or the street. It's it's the most common Greek word that you could probably find, they're just called the road. And that's a place on which people travel, on which people move. And so you have these very kind of active migratory words that are used to describe the church collectively right from the very beginning. I mean, you could also look at key characters. Barnabas, he's a migrant from Cyprus. Priscilla and Aquila, they're explicitly described as refugees, as Jewish refugees from Rome when Claudius expels them. Apollos, he's from Alexandria, but then we meet him in Ephesus. And then he goes to Corinth. Even Paul himself, he's from Tarsus, but we first meet him in Jerusalem. So we have this big cast of kind of scattered migrant characters who are really important to the development of the church. I think one of my favorite ones is, I mean, commentators do this all the time, where they talk about the Antiochian community and their involvement in Paul's mission. The Antiochian community, when you look at the list, and I have it here, it says, now the church in Antioch, there were prophets and teachers, a broad range of gifts. And we have Barnabas, we know from early in the text, he's from Cyprus. Simeon, who is called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a member of the court of Herod the ruler, or was raised with Herod. That's another possible translation of that. And Saul, and we know Paul is from Tarsus, which is a little bit closer to Antioch, but still it's still a good day's journey away. So these are all people from different places, and none of them commentators quite often mention the diversity of the group in Antioch, but one thing that really strikes me about that group is that none of them are from Antioch. So we try to describe it as an Antiochian community. None of them are from Antioch. It's a migrant church, and they're the first church that's intentional about being involved in mission and sending Paul and Barnabas to Cyprus.
Yeah. The only one that's not mentioned, just as you picked up on your reading up, this Simeon there's no denominators for like this ambiguates where he's from, but his name is clearly not.
Yeah, that's true. Syrian. Yeah, it's
name.
Yeah, it's so we're not told where. Yeah, so we're not told where he's from. But we're told about his complexion.
So he could have been born there, but was like his parents migrated, but obviously we don't know.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, so we don't know. But if he's not a migrant, then he's probably the child, or in kind of a generation of people who traveled there from elsewhere. And that would be fairly common and not unusual in the ancient world either. So it's not something that would really shock anyone or be really different. But it does kind of change, I think, our perspective of the church. Like, oh, this is a church of a bunch of people who aren't native to Antioch. You maybe put it that way. They're not native to this place.
It's like your children, they are born here.
Yeah. But they have American passports and Irish passports.
They are Scottish in one way, but they're not in another way.
They're Scottish in one. Yeah, they sound Scottish, but their accents are sort of kind of somewhere between my own and my wife's. And, when they're watching the rugby at the weekend, they cheer for Ireland. Why do they do that?
Absolutely unheard, by the way.
Yeah, I know, and it's a funny thing because that's not something we've imposed on them, but they've just kind of picked up. When it comes to sport, we support Ireland, not Scotland, and it's not something intentional. I say, if you guys want to support Scotland, it's absolutely fine. Say no, we're.
Yeah, and that tells a bit of the story which we're actually talking about from the biblical text.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and then the sort of, we might like, how does migration actually help us understand Acts better, or what does perspective does it bring to us? Like, you already sort of like been around
Yeah, recognized it. Yeah.
but how can we sort of, how does it help us understand Acts?
Yeah, I mean, this is a work in progress because it is my thesis as well.
Sure.
But I think a really interesting one is Barnabas.
Mm.
Well, he's Joseph Barnabas, right? So he comes to Jerusalem from Cyprus. He sells a field that belongs to him.
Mm.
He lays it at the apostles' feet. And he's definitely set, even though we have a chapter break there, he's set in contrast to Ananias and Sapphira. We have this guy from Cyprus. He's a Levite. So he's an insider, but also an outsider. What did Levites do in Cyprus? We don't have a whole lot of information about that, but he's a really interesting character because he seems to be very much a kind of hybrid. There's a lot of hybrid identities going on with with Joseph Barnabas. Actually, I was looking into names that are used, and we have Barnabas is a really uncommon name, and we only have one Jewish Barnabas that's attested, and we only know that this Barnabas was a Jew because it's a tax receipt that's showing receipt for payment to the Fiscus Judaicus
Outside the New Testament, yeah.
outside the New Testament. So
Yeah.
that's the only other Jew that we know of. I mean, there might have been more. Obviously, we don't have everything written down, but we only know of. So we have Barnabas in the New Testament. We have this other Barnabas from Egypt who was paying a tax. So these are the only Jewish Barnabases we know of. A very uncommon name. The most common name, and I was relying on the work of Margaret Williams, who's also based here at Edinburgh, looking at names, onomastics in the ancient world. And she's got this really fascinating study of the name Joseph, which is common. You have different kind of naming practices in the diaspora, and different naming practices in Palestine. But one name that's popular across both is Joseph. There's so many Josephs. So you have this guy arriving who's from Cyprus, and he has a very common name, and it says the disciples give him the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. But huioparkalesos doesn't actually, etymologically, Barnabas doesn't directly mean son of encouragement. And there's been a lot of ink spilled about trying to make this fit. But I think if you look at kind of, so I looked into kind of migrant nicknaming trends and study of how migrants take nicknames and give each other nicknames. And it can show that more so than just the etymology of the name, what really matters is that the nickname is like a mnemonic of community. So the nickname shows someone's belonging to a community. And quite often nicknames have meanings that don't directly match the etymology, and they take on new and different meanings. So you have a guy with a very common name. He gets given a very uncommon name, and they give the meaning to this name as son of encouragement, which really kind of explains how Barnabas acts and the rest of when we have him until he parts ways with Paul. It very much describes his character as an encourager or as one who is involved. And he's the one who brings Paul to the church. He's the one that advocates on behalf of Paul. So he's very much an advocate and encourager. And this kind of name describes, it's kind of it's a wee hint to what Barnabas is going to do later in the narrative. I mean, I think how migration studies helps in this particular instance is that it takes us away just from using text to try to figure out, how does the etymology match Luke's translation? And if you look at it in the context of migration, this is actually a very normal thing where you can have an etymology that takes on a new and fresh meaning, especially if someone is integrated into the community and is part of that community. And that would be quite a common thing. So he's no longer, Joseph Barnabas is no longer just an anonymous Joseph who's living in Jerusalem. He's Barnabas, son of encouragement. And sometimes nicknames can take these kind of unusual and community-defined meanings. So it kind of takes us outside of just looking in a dictionary to try to solve what it means, but also it takes us into what's really significant is that this guy is given a nickname, not just what the nickname means. So I think sometimes migration, looking at it through that lens, can tell us a little bit about some of the social dynamics that were going on. And Luke is reflecting those in his text. He's obviously observed these things happening. He's written about it. And so he's describing these dynamics and he's just explaining it happened. He doesn't need, I think it might have been obvious to his audience what was going on there. But when we look at it from the perspective of migration, we can maybe give some more insight to what's happening in some of these stories. So that's one example. There's others as well, but I think that's an interesting one because it's a real conundrum what the name, linking the name Barnabas etymologically to huios parakaleos. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be a call.
Yeah, we know that from outside that that's a normal way of like applying.
And it's well documented and well studied.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
But I suppose you could also say, Priscilla and Aquila, if you see later through Paul's epistles, we see them back in Rome, which is really interesting. So they have, but I know there's been some kind of questions cast over Priscilla and Aquila, and could they have traveled that much? And actually, there's good historical precedent for it. And they're described as migrant laborers, and that kind of frames why Paul goes where he goes. He's all the places that go are big urban centers where you would need people working on textiles, or we say tent maker, but that's another tricky one. But there's a whole, it's still some kind of form of migrant labor. And that's probably how Paul funds himself and how he ends up working in places like Ephesus and Corinth and Athens as well, because the Athens story starts in the marketplace. It doesn't. We always consider the Areopagus Hill, but actually starts in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I was thinking, the leather work, maybe once Thessalonians were like leather workers, like Paul. Let's talk to Zach about that in a different episode. Quite interesting. What was his other profession? But maybe that's a discussion for another time.
There's probably is. It could take up a whole nother hour.
I'm sure they could. So I think we already established that migration was very relevant in the early church. But then, what are the theological and missional application for migration in that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of them. To be clear, I don't think that the book of Acts is like a handbook on how to treat migrants today. I don't think that's Luke's aim. So his narrative aim is to provide an accurate history, as he puts it, of how the church grew and spread and how they were faithful to Jesus throughout that whole process. But migration is a big part of that story. And that's how the church actually moves. That's the initial movement from Jerusalem to Samaria is not an intentional thing. It's something that happens because there's persecution. It looks, when it says all the church was scattered, but the apostles remain, that's another tricky one that makes more sense in the context of migration studies as well, because quite often leaders can go to ground when other people where people who are probably less well known in the movement are sometimes at greater risk. But you have this, but it's not an intentional thing. They don't send people to Samaria originally, but that's how it happens, is through, a horrible killing, and then everyone else being scared and having to leave. But I think
Philip ends up in Caesarea.
Yeah. Well, I didn't even talk about the Ethiopian yet. That's another Ethiopian. Yeah, because he meets him on the wilderness road, and there's no reason for Philip to go that way, but that's where God sends him. And quite often Ethiopia and Herodotus anyways explicitly associated with the ends of the earth. So it's interesting that even by that stage, Acts 1:8 has almost been fulfilled before the church even knows about it.
That's actually quite common. I just want to put that note.
that in the ancient world, if you read Greek literature, like the Ethiopians are this sort of like an exotic, like better people.
Yeah, yeah.
And because they live so far away from what they know. So they almost like, so they, even though they look different, another thing is that's for the ancient person, that was like that's the kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was like, these people, they live in a different place. They're better people than us.
Yeah.
Kind of like idea. That, and you'll probably find that in Herodotus, but also in other like even in the, you have this idea almost in the Iliad and the Odyssey as well, where it talks about these people living on the edge of the world, which are sort of like little better people. They're almost like God.
Yeah, it's exotic, it's exciting, and he's obviously, he he's obviously a person of means as well, because he has a whole scroll in his chariot, you know, so these are not cheap things just to be reading Isaiah scroll as you're traveling. So,
and you know, if anybody has read Isaiah, it's a long.
It's a very long book, yeah. So I mean, so you get this kind of sense of God being active in Acts through migration, through the whole book, and the church just kind of accepts it, responds faithfully in situations of migration. And I also think, you know, if you look at Acts, it's very much, I think, from the perspective of migration.
Yeah.
So even when we get the we sections, when we get to chapter 16, and we get this first person plural, so we did this, we went there, you kind of get this sense. But even then, Luke, who's narrating it, we get this sense of movement. It's a very, something's always happened in Acts. They're always moving. They're always going somewhere. It's definitely from the kind of, the book is written not from a settled perspective. And I'm going to write the book from, you know, let's say Luke's in Rome. I'm going to write it from Rome, and I'm going to talk about these places, but he talks about these places as if he's there, and if he's, so he's there and he's moving to other places as well. He's not kind of a detached narrator who's telling it from afar. So he's very much involved in the migratory process as this thing is going on. I mean, you could call that travel as well, but we see so many people like Peter. He ends up leaving Jerusalem and goes to Joppa, and then we find him in Caesarea. You know, Philip goes to Caesarea, stays there. So we do have migration and resettlement in there. And the book is very much written from this perspective. And I think and not everybody finds it convincing, but I really like Gregory Sterling's argument that places Luke within the diaspora tradition. So he doesn't kind of, he doesn't say whether or not Luke's a Jew or a Gentile or anything like that. He says, I think he's at least is very well versed in the diaspora tradition. He uses Septuagint all the time. You know, he cites it all the time, and it's very much there's a diaspora kind of, the book, his perspective is very much informed by the diaspora tradition. And when you look at what Paul does, so there's a great passage when Paul goes to Philippi, and he casts a demon, the python spirit, out of the slave girl. And everybody gets really mad at Paul. Why? Because, well, their chance of making money is now done. So Paul goes in to this place and he starts messing around with things. You know, he ends up upsetting the economic structure. He ends up creating social disruption as well. And then there's this great line when the people in Philippi get mad at Paul and they say, these men are disturbing our city. They are Jews and are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or observe. So they don't even talk about Paul as a Christian. They say, oh, he's a Jew. He's a Judean. He's from another place. And he's given us a whole bunch of laws that aren't for us as Romans. And it's a very kind of xenophobic critique of Paul. That's what it's based on. It's based on, they don't really talk about his message. They talk about his ethnicity. They don't even talk about, you know, the deliverance or the healing or anything like that. It's like they're advocating customs that aren't for us. It's, you know, it's contrary to the lay of the land. So it's an interesting perspective, I think, I mean, I'm very well settled in Scotland. This is a place that I live. I'm not from here, but I consider myself settled. But it's quite often the characters in Acts are the ones who are causing social disruption. They're the ones who are bringing difference, and people who are living there are thinking, whoa, we don't want any part of this. And it's sometimes, when you read it from that perspective, you're almost like, for someone like me who's settled, it's then you're approaching the text from a different perspective. Like, oh, I'm looking at this all from the perspective of the migrants, from the people who are moving, from the people who are being sent in different places. So it's a total shift of perspective. So it's not a sedentarist text. It's a mobile text. And I think when we maybe ethically and kind of missionally respond to this and some very real challenges of migration, it changes our perspective about this, and it takes us away from like a parochial vision of the church to something that's more global and something that is almost characterized by its movement in a way. And so I think for Luke, migration is normal and it's just part of his story. He doesn't go out to say, do this or do that when migrants come. But he tells us the story about migration, tells us kind of very current, kind of contemporary stories about migrants causing disruption. But for us, the people that we identify with as Christians reading the text are the people causing the disruption. So that can be an uncomfortable place to read the text from, but I think an important one in it, and maybe helps us maybe approach. I mean, we can all have different policy. We can argue and debate policy decisions around migration, and Christians can have valid opinions on different sides of immigration debates. But I think if it doesn't start from a place of empathy and even a kind of, or from a perspective of Christianity that is not global, because it's definitely not a book that portrays Christianity as something that is geographically bounded. It's something that is unbounded. So the church is, there's a book, it came out a few years back called Scattered But Gathered, as describing kind of migration. It's a contemporary missiology book talking about world Christianity, but it kind of centers on the church in Acts is definitely scattered, but gathered around the person of the ascended Christ, who is not geographically bound. And the ascended Christ makes cameos all over the place. In Acts, he directly intervenes in the narrative in a couple of different ways. He even speaks to Paul, when he's on the road to Damascus. He sees Stephen in Jerusalem. He forbids Paul from going into Asia. You have this. The ascended Christ is not geographically bound, and the church is gathered around this person and is no longer geographically bound to a particular location, but the church is everywhere, all the way to the ends of the earth. So it's a perspective shift. I think that's a helpful way to engage. It's a good starting point for engaging with kind of bigger questions of what do we do now?
Yeah, both mythologically, maybe migration and other things like that.
Yeah, I think even with how we receive migrants, Christian migrants from other places into our churches, what can they, how can their experience teach us about how we read the Bible? How can they contribute to our communities? And it can be a thing, by welcoming people, can be a real way to revitalize the church as well. It's a good challenge, but it's not always easy, because it changes how things are done. You have to cross cultural boundaries. You have to maybe deal with other languages, different cultures, and that can be challenging. But it's God doesn't always want us to do easy things.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But we come to the part of the podcast where we're talking about application.
Okay.
So, how can each of the listeners and viewers of the podcasts apply this conversation to their everyday life and walk with Christ?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think just to get back, because this is a podcast about Greek and biblical languages, and I think part of it is I'm not particularly gifted, again, at language acquisition, but I think there's so much to gain, and there's so much, my enjoyment of Scripture and what I've learned from Scripture has been really enriched by studying the ancient languages. So I think that's definitely, so I don't want people to be, I want just to encourage people practically that it's worth it. And it's like you said, you don't expect fluency on day one, but there's there's podcasts like this. There's lots of other tools, things that are freely available. There's books. There's lots of, and it's definitely just worth having a go. And if you're interested, then it's not for super smart or for an elite crew. It's something that anybody can do. And we at Park and Nazarene, we were doing a beginner's Greek class without tests or examinations, but we were just for people who had never learned another language before, and we were learning Greek step by step. We just, instead of trying to take the fear out of it and just try to enjoy the language and actually enjoying the kind of different perspective you get by learning another language, a language that has a very different kind of verbal system to our kind of temporal way of looking at things in English and other European languages. So it's a real, just gets you to think in another way, and that's really exciting. So I think practically it's worth the time and effort. It's not easy, but it can be fun and it can be enjoyable. It's definitely worth going. It's not for an elite group of people that are particularly smart or gifted at languages. It can be for those of us who have those of us who have dyslexia. There's a lot. I think so. That would be one practical thing. It's just enjoy Greek, get into it, and have a go. It's like riding a bike. You don't. You try until you don't learn until you try. And just as for migration, I think I would just encourage people to take a biblical perspective on that. And I don't mean just proof texting, when looking at one verse that will solve all our problems, but trying trying to have a biblical perspective on migration, let the Bible actually shape how we look at it rather than just answering the questions, but kind of getting into the narrative. And how does Scripture look at migration? How does it look at refugee movements? How does Scripture talk about these events? And how does that change how we look at these things? Yeah, it's something that I think has been part of the church's identity since the book of Acts, and even before that as well, with the story of God's people up to the time of the church as well. Yeah, let that story and that perspective inform your thinking about migration, and then hopefully we can approach the issues with, we can approach migration with challenges associated with it, with a bit more empathy and a bit more humanity, because I think that's definitely the perspective that the Bible has on it.
Yeah, they're like looking to your neighbor, seeing people as your neighbor, no matter where they come from. Before, that's the first thing, like especially as a Christian, is that what we're called to do. Policy is a different thing; it's more complicated, and it's a completely different discussion.
Yeah, it starts with the call to love God and to love neighbor, and Jesus links these two things. Also, everyone's made in the image of God as well, and I think that's another very biblical perspective, that all people are image bearers. That's an important starting point, and that's not our ethical base for engaging in these conversations. And I think we will struggle later on to make good decisions.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about a different application.
Okay.
So as we were talking and thinking about like Acts 1:8, for example, like is that the migration is spreading of the gospel. So that's when we as Christians, when we move somewhere else, what we bring with us is Christ.
Yeah.
And we can bring it into that community, and we can bring salvation to that community, not because we are anything specific, but because we serve a Lord that can save.
Yeah, it's, the gospel goes global in Acts, but it's people who take that message. And I think now I might have to, and I might get this wrong because I don't have it in front of me, but when it talks about the scattered ones, and it says, some translations say they went from place to place sharing the word, and I think it's dielphon. They went around. They moved around to spread. So it's a non-directive movement. It's not, it's not, they went there and spread the word, but it's kind of like they moved about and they spread the word, and they moved about. So it's not always destination based, but it's just something that they do as they're moving with events that are outside of their control. Yeah. The gospel is always on their lips, and it's something that they're bearing witness to no matter where they're at. And that's a really exciting and a huge challenge to us as well, because it's not always easy to do that.
Yeah, thank you for this. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me, Daniel. Yeah. It was interesting to you, and hopefully as well.
I loved it. It's just very good. And I think they will be very interesting for people to listen to. And God bless you in your studies. And thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And you too.
Okay. Cheers. And to you guys, I'll see you next time.
But before you go, if you enjoyed this podcast and you want more people to see it, please subscribe and leave a like. It really helps us create more episodes like this one. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.